Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll examine a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin on this one-year anniversary of the return of Trump, which sounds like the title of a cheesy horror movie, but unfortunately is proving to be the horrific reality of what we are enduring today. Joining us is Ngai, an historian of immigration to the United States and how it impacts domestic politics as Trump uses the border issue as a weapon against his political enemies by unleashing his private army of ICE thugs on Democratic cities and states, with the likelihood that they'll be used to intimidate Democratic voters in the November midterm elections. She is a professor of history and Lung Family Professor of Asian American Studies at Columbia University. A legal and a political historian interested in questions of immigration, citizenship, and nationalism. She is the author of Impossible Subjects, Illegal Aliens in the Making of Modern America, The Lucky Ones, One Family, and the Extraordinary Invention of Chinese America. And her latest book is The Chinese Question, The Gold Rushes and Global Politics. Then we'll speak with Paul Pillar, the Director of Graduate Studies at the Center for Peace and Security Studies at Georgetown University. He had a 28-year career in the United States intelligence community, in which his last position was National Intelligence Officer for the Near East and South Asia, and is the author of Terrorism and U.S. Foreign Policy, Negotiating Peace, War Termination as a Bargaining Process, and Why America Misunderstands the World. We will discuss his article at Responsible Statecraft, Phase Farce, No Way Board of Peace Replaces Reality in Gaza. Then finally we'll look into the latest sellout of the Kurds who fought with the Americans against ISIS, but now are being sacrificed by Trump as ISIS prisoners are being released by the new Syrian government. Joining us is Joshua Landis, the Sandra Mackey Chair and Director of the Center for Middle East Studies and the Farnazeh Family Center for Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies at the University of Oklahoma. The past president of the Syrian Studies Association. He is a fellow at the Quincy Institute and writes Syria Comment, a daily newsletter and blog on Syrian politics. And before we begin at the start of this new year, which will culminate in the fateful midterm elections in November, polls already indicate MAGA Republicans will lose the House and possibly the Senate. But we're up against a Trump-Miller presidency already drunk with power, and they will do anything to stay in power, having already demonstrated their contempt for the United States Constitution with Trump's January 6, 2001 coup attempt. They see over half of the country as their enemy and have a private army of loyal thugs ready to round up critics of the regime they label as communist lunatics. As Trump cowers, the media and his cronies buy up the mainstream press, Background Briefing will continue to expose this malevolent regime's fascistic machinations, providing a daily insight into the news as a massive coalition of people power is mobilized to bring about an end to this nightmare and usher in a new era of reform not seen since Nixon departed the presidency in disgrace. To help save America's 250-year-old democracy, we need all hands on deck, and you can make a tax-deductible donation to help us do our part at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org. And thank you. And joining us now is Ngai, Professor of History and the Lung Family Professor of Asian American Studies at Columbia University. And her latest book is The Chinese Question, The Gold Rushes and Global Politics. Welcome to Background Briefing, Ngai.
Good to be with you, as always, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us, May, on this one-year anniversary of Donald Trump's return. And it seems pretty clear that he's using the border issue as a weapon against his political enemies, particularly as we see in Minneapolis, where the Justice Department is now going after the mayor, the Democratic governor, who happened to be the vice president on the ticket running against Trump in 2024. Also the Attorney General now of Minnesota, they're going against him. And there's a lot of speculation, and I think it's quite reasonable, that Trump will use ICE to intimidate voters in November in the midterms. But at this point, it's pretty unprecedented to have a law enforcement organization that's supposed to protect and serve American citizens, attacking, terrorizing them, invading the streets, acting like criminals, not law enforcement. And they've already murdered a woman, and there's no end in sight. And now Trump is planning on deploying 1,500 troops from Alaska who are trained in winter warfare. So am I correct in suggesting that this is an unusual use of immigration authority?
Yes, Ian, it is absolutely horrific what is unfolding in Minnesota this last few weeks. They're acting like criminals, as you say. They're acting like Gestapo is what they're doing. They're acting in ways that far exceed their legal authority. Stephen Miller has told them they have absolute immunity for anything they do. That actually is not true. But as we know, with many things in this administration, they don't care about breaking the law or acting outside of the law. So I think you're right that this is part of the reason for this immigration crackdown is to intimidate or seek retribution against political enemies in democratic states. Minnesota was one of I think it was the only state in the upper Midwest that did not vote for Trump. Twice they did not vote for Trump. So there is that going on. There is the message they're sending that they will intimidate voters, come the midterms in September. But I think also this immigration crackdown it serves a number of other purposes. It's a multi-pronged agenda, on their part. Um, I think at one level, it's part of their push to really rid the country of people of color and stop people of color from coming in. They suspended visas for people from 75 countries. These are legal immigrations that are already in the system, but they're stopping the processing of them, and they're almost all from the global south. They've already pretty much ended the right to seek asylum in this country. There's, over 1 million people with asylum cases pending, and they're just trying to tell them you don't have a case anymore. And they're picking up people in courthouses who come for their hearings. And of course, I think immigration is politically, it's a key issue for the MAGA base, because this desire to create a white Christian nation by deporting all the immigrants, deporting people of color, is the biggest piece of red meat that Trump has to get his base riled up and to keep them engaged with him. And they're going to more and more extreme measures to do all these things.
And of course, the only immigrants that Trump is letting in, refugees, white refugees from South Africa,
Right.
who are coming here on the fraudulent basis that they're somehow being harassed and mistreated in South Africa, which the South African government strenuously denies.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I think what's happened is really shocks the conscience. The brutality, murdering people. You know, I think 2 days ago they dragged an elderly Hmong man from his house in his underwear in the freezing cold. The man is a U.S. citizen, and after an hour of grilling him, they just sent him back home. But that they would act in these ways, and they broke down his door. They wouldn't answer the door. They don't have to answer the door. They broke into the house. They uh, held his daughter-in-law at gunpoint while they grabbed him. So this, and of course, the murder of Renee Good last week. So it's just a horrific scene, and I don't know what's going to stop it.
Well, the damage they do, for example, when they smash car windows and run into cars to drive, push them off the road, they've done this a lot. Is there any mechanism for people to have their cars repaired or their doors repaired? As far as I know, there's not.
Well, there may be a lot of lawsuits for damages. I don't know when they'll ever get their money or if they'll ever get heard in court. I read something briefly today that the Democrats say they have made some kind of agreement in the Congress to put some curbs on ICE, to give them not as much money as they had been promised, although they're still going to get most of the money, to require that all ICE officers get training, so that they don't do things like, break down people's doors or pepper spray bystanders, beat up witnesses, that they're going to require them to wear body cameras. But, they need to just pull these people off the street. They're a menace. They're like Gestapo. And I think what the Democrats got, if it's true, is pretty it's not very much, in my opinion.
Well, we're talking about 170 billion in the big bad beautiful bill, and it's worth noting that we, the taxpayers, are paying for these thugs to beat up American citizens on the streets of America and intimidate and terrorize people. And this enormous amount of money that is gone to ICE came at the expense of American health care, which is what
Absolutely.
was cut in the bill, along with, of course, accommodating massive tax breaks for billionaires. So that's the reality of it. And of course, there's 45 billion in the 170 billion to build detention facilities. There's little to no oversight of the two major prison industrial complex outfits, CoreCivic and Geo Group. There's also 30 billion for operations, and tremendous amount of money is being spent. I think they're giving out $50,000 bonuses for people to sign up and join ICE, and clearly the bar has been lowered in terms of qualifications. But since this is the first year of Trump, this is January the 20th, and he came in January the 20th a year ago. In terms of how you see this first year, I mean, I thought it made sense to talk to you, May, because I think immigration is the main issue that he's seized on, but he's using it for other nefarious means. But do you see the plan in this? I mean, the fact that Stephen Miller is, in effect, the co-president, he has more influence than the vice president does. He's close to Trump. The actual chief of staff, she talked out of school to Vanity Fair and now has been marginalized. So he's more powerful than ever. But it seems to me from day one, this was their plan. What do you think?
Well, you're right. It has been their plan since day one. It was actually all mapped out in that Project 2025 document that came out a year before the last election. So this has been their plan. But here's the thing. Of all the money that they've pumped into DHS and ICE, all the thugs that they've hired, really just thugs off the street as ICE officers, all the arrests that they're making, and all the deportations, they cannot meet the numbers that they have set themselves as a goal. Miller has said, and he actually announced this late in the spring, when they were arresting fewer than 1,000 people a day. He said that he wants 3,000 arrests a day. The average daily arrest is still less than 1,000. He wants 1 million deportations a year. In 2025, they deported about 500,000. So although they are ramping up, I don't think that they have the capacity, even with all this money, to meet those numbers. And so part of what we see is obviously the brutality and the harm and the terror that they are spreading. But we also have to understand that part of it is spectacle, meant to make people afraid. And, as they pour more and more ICE agents into Minnesota, that means fewer agents in other cities. To get their numbers, they have to have going on across the country what they're right now doing in one city. And that's not to say they're not active in other cities. They are picking up people in New York and California, all over the country. But the inefficiency of their operations is actually quite stunning. They have to send 10 to 12 ICE agents down the street in Minnesota to grab one person. That's very inefficient. So I think we have to look at both sides of what's going on. On the one hand, there's the horror and the terror of it. and the brutality. On the other hand, um, if you imagine what it would take for them to actually make their numbers, we'd have to see this scenario all over the country. And I don't think they can do it. I don't think the American people in the cities will stand for it. The people in Minnesota have really stood up against ICE, you know, and apparently, we hear this on social media or in the news. There are ICE agents who are saying, don't send me to Minnesota. I don't want to go there because they are hounded by the communities. So I think we'll see what happens. It's going to be tough.
But the fact that this administration and this particularly, I think, disgraceful Department of Justice that is just enabling criminality, and Trump keeps pardoning the worst kind of criminals and scammers, etc. You've got the fact that they are moving heaven and earth to protect Jonathan Ross, the ICE officer who murdered Renee Good, shot her 4 times, once in the face, twice in the chest, and once in the arm. And they're going after everybody else, the Attorney General of the Mayor of Minneapolis and also the governor. But they are moving heaven and earth to protect him, the killer, who, after he'd killed her, is heard saying, effing bitch. And another ICE officer who was beating up a Marine veteran said to the Marine veteran, haven't you learned your lesson? Didn't you see what we did to that effing lesbian? I mean,
Right.
this is what is going on. This is all about intimidating us and letting us know that these guys are above the law. And the idea that the United States government has a private army that's above the law, to me, is a major, major step towards American fascism.
Oh, Ian, I think we're already there. If
Well,
this isn't fascism, I don't know what is.
right. And what about the solutions then? We don't want to leave our audience in despair, as bad as it is.
Well, I think, in every major city and even in smaller cities and towns, people are organized. People are, they have rapid response teams. We've all read about or seen videos of people with patrols in communities, of people with the whistles. People are organized, and you can participate at any level you want. You don't have if you don't want to go on patrol, that's okay. You can do other things. A lot of communities have block associations, they have WhatsApp groups for their neighbors. Those are activated all over the country where people are using them to buy groceries for their immigrant neighbors because they're afraid to go outside. They're taking their kids to school. They're ready with the whistles if ICE comes around. But there's people being organized all over the country, and I think at the very grassroots level, Americans are not going to let this happen. And let me say this, Ian, I'm a student of immigration. I've studied immigration and American politics around immigration since the 19th century. And in the past, when the government has attacked immigrants, ordinary Americans have not come to their side. Immigrants have had to face these attacks on their own, for their own communities, with very few allies. When they put Japanese Americans in the concentration camps, the only people who objected were the Quakers. Nobody else came to their defense, and when they haul people away, over the years, it's only the immigrant communities themselves who have had to say, no, stop, don't do it. And now I think we see a very different picture where regular people, American citizens, white people, are appalled at what's happening and they're willing to do something about it. So I think we're going to see a lot more suffering and attacks in the coming period, but we're also going to see resistance, and we'll see what happens.
But just in closing, May, whites, in spite of this push for white nationalism and this war on woke, which is really a dog whistle for racism, these
Right.
people like Hegseth and Trump and Miller and company, they're fighting against a multicultural reality that America has changed, that whites will be a minority if they're not already. And it's a futile battle. You drive by any U.S. high school today and you see this beautiful rainbow coalition of these young kids from mixed marriages and mixed ethnicities. And it's a beautiful tableau of how America is today. And, going back to the Ozzie and Harriet days of when blacks and Latinos and Chinese and Asians were invisible, that's never going to happen.
Right, and that's the fight, that's the battle, right? Because and that's what freaks them out the most, that they're not the majority, or they're rapidly becoming a minority. And I think, I think the country's better for immigration. It's better for having a multicultural society, a multiracial democracy. And the people who think that they stand to lose, they're resorting more and more to Nazi rhetoric. And hopefully, the American people will reject that. I mean, Trump has a hardcore base of MAGA supporters, but he doesn't have more than 35% of the electorate. And a lot of people are turning away from him. So I think even though it's a dreadful time right now, we should try to be optimistic about the future.
Well, May Ngai, thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with May Ngai, who's a professor of history and the Long Family Professor of Asian American Studies at Columbia University, a legal and political historian interested in questions of immigration, citizenship, and nationalism. She is the author of Impossible Subjects, Illegal Aliens and the Making of Modern America, The Lucky Ones, One Family, and the Extraordinary Invention of Chinese America. And her latest book is The Chinese Question, The Gold Rushes and Global Politics. We're going to take a brief station break and back looking into Trump's $1 billion ahead Board of Peace and how it is not replacing the reality in Gaza. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Paul Pillar, who's the Director of Graduate Studies at the Center for Peace and Security Studies at Georgetown University. He had a 28-year career in the U.S. intelligence community, in which his last position was National Intelligence Officer for the Near East and South Asia, and is the author of Terrorism and U.S. Foreign Policy, Negotiating Peace, War Termination as a Bargaining Process, and Why America Misunderstands the World. And he has an article at Responsible Statecraft, Phase Farce, No Way Board of Peace Replaces Reality in Gaza. Welcome to Background Briefing, Paul Pillar.
Good to be with you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And today in Jerusalem, the Israelis bulldozed the UN headquarters of UNRWA in East Jerusalem, and they tore down the UN flag and put up the Israeli flag. And as far as I know, that's still UN territory, isn't it? That compound.
I'm sure it would be. UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, just to remind people, is the UN humanitarian aid agency that has been focused for decades on providing relief to the Palestinians. And Israel has always been very much opposed to it, mainly because it embodies the fact that there is a Palestinian nationality and also that these are refugees. So it's been going on for many years. Israel has done everything they possibly can to oppose UNRWA.
Well, they've accused UNRWA of having a bunch of Hamas members. They said there were 19 Hamas fighters inside UNRWA, and there was an internal investigation that identified 9, but there's 13,000, so 9 out of 13,000. But the hostility towards UNRWA is pretty clear. But also today, Israel is barring members of the technocratic committee that set up to administer Gaza under President Trump's plan. So at what point does Trump and Netanyahu come to blows over this? Because it's pretty clear that Netanyahu's not going along with Trump's plan. He's doing what he can not to appear to be completely obstructionist, but clearly at the end of the day he wants to sabotage it.
Well, the main dynamic here, as far as where Netanyahu and the Israeli government as a whole is coming from, is continued opposition to anything that hints of Palestinian self-governance. And the committee to which you refer, which is set up under Trump's 20-point peace plan, is a committee of Palestinian technocrats headed by a civil engineer named Ali Shaf, who was formerly a deputy transportation minister in the Palestinian Authority. They recently had their initial meeting in Cairo. The Egyptians have certainly played a major part in making this all possible. And this group of Palestinian technocrats is supposed to provide the administrative structure for an interim administration of the Gaza Strip. And the reason Netanyahu and company in Israel don't like that is that here you're talking about a form of Palestinian self-government, even though it, of course, falls far, far short of a true Palestinian state. I mean, in terms of when or if Netanyahu and Trump would come to blows on these issues, I think this then comes down to Trump's attention span and how much attention he's given to Greenland or something else, and whether he would basically lose interest in this whole Gaza and Palestinian-Israeli thing. Despite the size of the issue and the amount of time that's been spent on it, I don't think it's an overstatement to say something like that, given what we know about Trump's attention span and how he has tried to come up with just enough of an agreement here, an agreement there, to claim that he's made peace and not really care about the follow-up.
Well, that's how Trump operates, right? It's all about photo ops and big flashy announcements, but there's no follow through. And
that's right. And I think in this case, if Netanyahu tomorrow or next week says, well, all bets are off and we're resuming, full-scale operations by the IDF in the Gaza Strip, I think Trump's reaction would basically be to probably go along with whatever the Israelis say, that blames it on, supposed Hamas violations of the ceasefire, even though the Israelis are the ones that have been violating it in volume by having daily attacks in the Gaza Strip.
So let's talk about this board of peace that Trump has set up. It has Tony Blair, who's not popular in the Arab world, Kushner, who wants to make beachfront property deals in Gaza, Witkoff, Trump's real estate buddy, who has got this portfolio along with the Russian one and seems to be completely in Putin's pocket, as is Trump. I mean, I don't know what do you make of what's going on in Greenland, Paul? Because it seems to me that what Greenland is really about is about destroying NATO. And why would Trump want to destroy NATO unless he's completely in Putin's pocket?
Well, I think as far as Putin is concerned, it's all about trying to destroy NATO and wreak as much division within the Western alliance as possible. As far as Trump is concerned, I think it goes more to his primitive acquisitiveness and trying to show that he's king of as much of the world as possible. And as far as the Western alliance and NATO are concerned, it's not so much a determination to destroy it on his part, but he just doesn't care and is continuing to show disdain, even as we speak, as he's going to Davos, disdain for the allies and what they do. And he basically doesn't care about alliances in general. So there's no question this is a huge gift to Putin as it relates to the Ukraine war, as it relates to everything else. The more division within the Western alliance, the better from his point of view.
So in terms of his board of peace, it looks as if when Trump offered a seat on the board of peace for $1 billion, you got to pony up $1 billion to get a seat on this board of peace. But then he offered it to, of all people, Russia's President Putin. And this has prompted the UK Prime Minister Starmer to consider not joining the board of peace. And UK's Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper told MPs on Tuesday that, quote, Putin is not a man of peace, and I don't think he belongs in any organisation with peace in the name. And Macron, who's at Davos, is also being sceptical of this, and he's declined Trump's invitation. And then Trump has now promised to put 200% tariffs on French wine and champagne. Turkey's Erdogan, he supposedly will decide. It'll cost him $1 billion, of course. The UAE is all in, it seems. Ukraine has been invited to join, but they basically said, well, why do we want to join a board with Russia? I mean, this whole thing, you refer to it as being farcical, right?
Yeah, well, we perhaps should be a bit more precise. I think the $1 billion price tag was put on anyone who wants permanent membership, and other countries could be on for a term of no more than 3 years, according to the White House, before they have to pony up the $1 billion. I think as far as the idea of Putin belonging to it is concerned, again, for him, it's a matter of staying in harness with his pal Donald Trump, especially if this means, being on Trump's side of destroying the Western alliance. I don't think Putin really cares all that much about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict itself these days, even though, there's a past history of the so-called quartet that the Russian government was involved in, along with the US and the EU and the UN, that tried to do some constructive diplomatic work. But those days are long gone. And for Putin, it's all a matter of Ukraine and trying to tear the West apart.
And for Netanyahu, as we were suggesting earlier, he has to play along with Trump. But it seems like his agenda, and particularly of the far right, that seems to be the tail that wags the dog of his government, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and company, they seem to determine to basically drive the Palestinians out of both Gaza and the West Bank. That's always been the dream of the Kurds. They've never really stated what their end game is vis-a-vis the Palestinians. But it seems to me that it's never been clearer to me that this is what the strategy is, just to make life so miserable, to demolish their homes, tear down their olive trees, do everything to make life miserable. In Gaza, they're all living in tents, and now there's all kinds of diseases breaking out. The food aid that's supposed to get through has been blocked by the Israelis. Everything indicates to me that this is really about trying to evict the Palestinian people, and that would be the solution. You'll end up with a one-state solution because you won't have any Palestinians.
Oh, I think there's no doubt about that. And in addition to the unlivable conditions that have been created in the Gaza Strip, there's, of course, a lot going on in the West Bank, in which activities by the Jewish settlers, aided and abetted in many cases by Israeli officialdom in the form of the IDF forces, has tried to make life for Palestinians on the West Bank as miserable as possible with, as you mentioned, digging up the olive trees and just pogroms, basically, of violence against Palestinian villages. I think there's no doubt in my mind that inside the Israeli government, each time there has been a move by Netanyahu supposedly toward peace, and I include the earlier ceasefire that Israel broke back in March of last year, and then the current supposed ceasefire, which really hasn't worked, that began last August, that he has assured the likes of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, the extremists in his government, that this is only temporary. He's doing what he has to do to placate Trump and to say to the world that, yeah, he's supposedly interested in peace, but that end goal of really doing away with any possibility of a Palestinian nation, let alone a state worthy of the name, is exactly as you described, Ian. And in fact, you listen to what the likes of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir say publicly, they have no doubt that this is all temporary, and they will resume their violent ways toward the goal that you mentioned before much more time goes by.
So do you think in any way that the change that's happened here in the United States vis-a-vis affection for Israel, where you've got a lot of young Americans now really being more sympathetic to the Palestinians than the Israelis. And for the longest times, I've been covering this thing for decades, and it's you worked for 28 years in the CIA on this whole matter, and it's sort of depressing in a way that it's kind of a competition of victimhood. And at this point, I'm wondering whether the fact that there's been a sea change in attitudes in this country, particularly amongst young Americans towards Israel, is that going to translate politically? Because it seems like Netanyahu is angling to try and at least get around the fact that the United States' number one recipient of U.S. aid is Israel. There are some countries in Africa and Latin America and around the world that desperately need help, but we give the lion's share of our aid to Israel. And recently Netanyahu said, well, we're going to wean ourselves from getting free military gifts from the United States. But then we learn the next day that the U.S. Army has a $2 billion deal to develop a armored personnel carrier with the Israelis. So where do you see the sea change in attitudes to Israel as a result of what's happened in Gaza translating politically in this country?
Well, there is indeed, a change that you can see in the polls, and I assume, Trump reads some of these polls as well. But the impact on policy goes beyond, unfortunately, just the shift in opinion that, as you mentioned, is particularly among younger generations and, more on the Democratic still than the Republican side. You've got the whole money equation in American politics and the role that has played in sustaining the special relationship, so-called, between the United States and Israel that supports all those billions of dollars of aid. And that is something that, many political candidates are still having to deal with. And as they make their calculations about how they're going to possibly trim their sails on this particular issue, it's not just a matter of looking at those polls. It's a matter of the money side as well as just the entrenched relationships that do affect a number of people in the administration, as well as people in the Democratic Party as well. So I'm not real optimistic that, yes, it is a sea change of sorts if you read the polls, but I'm not optimistic that it's going to translate quickly into what I would describe as a sea change in U.S. policy.
Well, just in closing, though, it seems that both the Democratic leaders, Schumer and Jeffries, who are tied close to AIPAC, they're not particularly popular. There's an interesting piece by David Plouffe, who ran the Obama campaigns and also the recent Harris campaign, almost suggesting that these leaders on the Democratic side are kind of relics, not necessarily because of their ties to AIPAC, but just in general, their kind of fecklessness. So it does seem that, at least on the Democratic side, there may be some change underway, coming up from the sort of Mandani wing of the party, if that's the way to describe it.
Yeah, and there will be plenty of debates inside the Democratic Party in the months ahead on exactly these issues, as well as the broader sense of, do we need to, become more of a Mamdani type party and abandon the Schumers and the Jeffries. We'll be hearing much more about that in the months ahead, no doubt.
Well, Paul Pillar, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
My pleasure.
And again, I've been speaking with Paul Pillar, who's the Director of Graduate Studies at the Center for Peace and Security Studies at Georgetown University. He had a 28-year career in the U.S. intelligence community, in which his last position was National Intelligence Officer for the Near East and South Asia. And he's the author of Terrorism and U.S. Foreign Policy, Negotiating Peace, War Termination as a Bargaining Process, and Why America Misunderstands the World. And he has an article at Responsible Statecraft, Phase Farce, No Way Board of Peace Replaces Reality in Gaza. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back looking into the latest sellouts of the Kurds who fought with the Americans against ISIS and are now being sacrificed by Trump as ISIS prisoners are being released by the new Syrian government. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Joshua Landis, the Sandra Mackey Chair and the Director of the Center for Middle East Studies and the Farzaneh Family Center for Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies at the University of Oklahoma. The past president of the Syrian Studies Association, he is a fellow at the Quincy Institute and writes Syria Comment, a daily newsletter and blog on Syrian politics. Welcome to Background Briefing, Joshua Landis.
It's a pleasure being with you, Ian, as always.
Well, thanks for joining us, Josh. And the clashes now between the Syrian army and the Kurdish forces in the north of Syria are alarming because there's a sense that, one, the Syrian government of Shara, who was a former jihadi, might be letting some of these ISIS prisoners out. And two, it's sort of reinforces the notion, the suspicion that a lot of people have, particularly the Israelis, that the leopard doesn't change his spots, that the former jihadi is not really reformed, as he said, and as Trump celebrated. What do you think?
Well, you're right on both counts. But first of all, I think it's important to realize this is a real turning point for Kurdish aspirations at negotiating some sort of autonomy in northeastern Syria. As we recall, U.S. teamed up with the Kurds of northeastern Syria, which make up about 12% of the Syrian population. The Kurds do, a separate ethnic group. Their language, Kurdish language, is an Indo-European language related to Persian rather than Arabic. And they have long struggled for some autonomy, and some of them want independence and to be with the 25 million other Kurds who live in Turkey, northern Iraq, and parts of Iran. So they, for 10 years, enjoyed autonomy, helped by the United States. And their militia, the Syrian Democratic Forces, as they were called, a Kurdish-led militia, but with many Arabs in it, ruled a quasi-independent little statelet in northeastern Syria. And today that has collapsed, and the government troops, led by Ahmed al-Shara, have really rolled back this Syrian Democratic Forces in a rather chaotic process. Negotiations fell apart, and this has been quite violent. And yes, then it comes to the question of the prisoners. There are roughly 10,000 ISIS fighters that are believed to still be in the prisons in northeastern Syria, and about 25,000 family members of ISIS who are kept in El Hol camp. And El Hol seems to have been opened up, and we're getting some reports that lots of people have fled from that. But the other two prisons are a little bit less clear what is going on. In Shadadi prison, which holds a few thousand ISIS fighters, that has switched hands from the SDF to the government forces. And it's been very chaotic because there's been some fighting about it. Both sides are accusing the others of allowing perhaps 100, 200 ISIS fighters to escape. It's not clear exactly what's happened, but we have photos of empty cells in Shadadi. In Akhtan, the other big camp, the Kurds have held out in that camp and are still there, and we don't believe that prisoners have escaped. So it's possible that there will be some kind of a negotiated transfer and that the Syrian government will be able to take charge of them without any releases as this unfolds.
Well, but you need a little context or history, don't you, Josh, on the role of the Kurds fighting with the Americans to extinguish the threat from ISIS. And, Trump celebrates getting rid of Baghdadi, but the Kurds were the ones that did most of the fighting and sacrificed a lot of lives, didn't they? I mean,
yes, they did. They did the heavy lifting. About 11,000 Kurds died fighting ISIS. They were the boots on the ground, trained and equipped by the United States. But rather sadly, this was a transactional relationship, as it turns out. And today, the United States has pivoted and has told the Kurds in no uncertain terms that they need to integrate into the Syrian government forces. And negotiations over the past, over the past year have gone on between Abdi, the head of the Kurdish forces, and Ahmed Shara, the president of Syria, over what terms those would be. And the Kurds wanted a measure of autonomy, to retain a measure of autonomy in the Northeast, and they wanted their soldiers to be folded in with whole divisions. The government said, no, you're not going to get a wide measure of political autonomy. You can have some language rights and so forth, but your soldiers are going to have to be brought in to the Syrian military on an individual basis, offering a few high positions, but really dismantling the SDF. And there was no real final agreement on this because there's deep distrust between the Kurds and the Arab government. And things fell apart. And today, the balance of power is on the side, firmly on the side of the Syrian government. And America has switched sides. And our ambassador, Barak, ambassador to Turkey and special envoy to Syria, just issued a declaration 2 hours ago in which he said that the Kurds, that their best hope for the future is to integrate on the government terms, and that there will be equality in Syria, etc. The Kurds do not believe that there will be equality, and it's unlikely that there will be. We've seen in March, there were massacres against the Alawites, another big minority, religious minority. And then in July against the Druze in southern Syria, a religious minority as well. So the Kurds are quite fearful that they're going to be marginalized and discriminated against.
So there is a history, of course, of the US selling out the Kurds, going back to Henry Kissinger, and then during the war against ISIS, Trump got rolled in a phone conversation by Erdogan, and this proxy force that the Turks controlled went in and massacred a bunch of Kurdish leaders, some of which were seen on video, just absolutely appalling. This really infuriated a lot in the US military because they have a lot of respect for the Kurds because they, as you point out, they did all the heavy lifting. So now this is a third betrayal, right?
It is indeed. It is indeed. And it does go back to Henry Kissinger in the 70s. The U.S. helped to arm the Kurdish Peshmerga, their fighters, against Saddam Hussein in order to get a better agreement on the border between Iraq and Iran. And at that time, America was on the side of Iran because the Shah was still in power. And so America armed up the Kurds and internal strife in Iraq in order to weaken Baghdad and get the agreement they wanted. When they did get the agreement they wanted, and Saddam Hussein accepted the borders demanded by Iran, America dropped the Kurds, and that led to a campaign against them, Al-Anfal campaign, as Saddam named it. And he named it that because there's a verse in the Quran which says to celebrate your victories and so forth. And he, somewhat ironically, the government in Damascus issued a decree just yesterday in which they use the Anfal surah in the Quran in order to ask mosques around the country to celebrate their victories in northeast Syria. So this echoed Saddam's rather bloody movement against the Kurds, which led to gassing of one particular town with many deaths.
So this is all to do with Trump's, and first of all, it was the Saudis who said, Mohammed bin Salman, in fact, who set up the meeting that Trump had with Shara, at which Trump decided he was a good guy and he liked his the cut of his jib or whatever, however you want to,
yes,
express that. So this is basically Trump has decided he doesn't care about the Kurds, right? And what's the role of Turkey in this? Because, I'm wondering whether they're going to take advantage of this as well.
You're absolutely right, Ian. The Turks have been pushing for this. They see an armed Kurdish element as a real danger to Turkey because of the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party in Turkey, which has fought a long and bloody campaign for self-determination in the eastern part of Turkey. So the Turks are threatened by this move by the Kurds, and they're now carrying out talks with the leader of the PKK, Öcalan, and this is going to play into Turkey's hands because, of course, it weakens the Kurds tremendously. But now let me, switch horses here for a second and look at this from Damascus's point of view. Damascus saw this Kurdish-run enclave as a real impediment to its self-determination, to its sovereignty. And after all, Syria is, according to the UN, a sovereign country, and America doesn't have the right to chop it up and give autonomy to the Kurds. So much of Syria's oil, much of its best agriculture, and the Euphrates River run through this region that had been dominated by the Kurds. So Syria, in order to rebuild after the devastation of this civil war that's lasted for 14 years, really needs those resources. And so Damascus was hell-bent on bringing an end to this autonomous region and disarming the Kurds and bringing Syria back under central control. And Saudi Arabia, Turkey, almost all the Arab states in the region have wanted this because they want to see Syria grow again. They want to see millions of refugees, which are weighing on the economies of surrounding countries, go back to Syria, and they needed to rebuild. And they all pleaded with Trump to make this happen, to lift sanctions on Syria, which had crushed the economy, and to, end their military support for the Kurds. And that has happened. And President Trump has bowed to that wish of his allies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. And so this has happened. It's happened at the expense of the Kurds. And it's a rather dramatic switch and collapse of the Kurds over the last few weeks, which has led to considerable bloodshed and great distress amongst the Kurdish people.
Well, you can't help feeling, sympathy for the Kurdish people, apart from the fact that they did the heavy lifting in getting rid of ISIS, working with the US. And their form of Islam, as you point out, is very different and much, I'm trying to think of the word, moderate, I guess. They're incredibly brave, the Peshmerga, those who face death. And I don't know, I've always admired the Kurds, and it would seem to me that of all the people in that tortured region, they should be the ones that we could most identify with. And certainly the US military feels that way.
That's true. And there have been many congressmen, senators, and European politicians. None of the top order, of course, unfortunately for the Kurds, who've spoken out and said, this is no way forward for Syria to rebuild its nation. It can't bring all of its minorities in by force. And that's not going to lead to a happy Syria. And Europe shouldn't be supporting this. On the other hand, European leaders and President Trump do support it, and their administrations support this, even though many of the politicians are quite unhappy. And I think many, as you say, many people in the American military who fought alongside the Kurds, depended on the Kurds, and have an emotional attachment to the Kurds, see this as a very sad day, no doubt about it. But there is great celebration going on in Syria on the part of the Arabs, who are, the Sunni Arabs are 70% of that country, and they see this as a key moment in rebuilding their country, leading towards economic rejuvenation, and perhaps lifting some of the 90 90% of the country that lives in poverty today out of poverty for the future.
And lifting the 90% out of poverty is that's an amazing statistic. It shows you how desperate the situation is. And that even has to happen, right, before the millions are repatriated from Turkey, where there are all kinds of Syrian refugees there, and also in Jordan, right? I think there's over 1 million in Jordan.
Yes, there are 1 million in Jordan, almost 1 million in Lebanon, and 3 million in Turkey. So all of those countries are looking forward to Syria rebuilding and being able to, for Syrians to be able to go home. Now, obviously, quite a few of those Syrians who've lived in these foreign countries for a decade will not want to go home because they have jobs, they've perhaps married, their kids have been brought up in these new countries. So it is like all these refugee problems. It's a thorny issue, and there's no clear answer to it.
So just in the last minute or so, Josh, what's the situation with the Russians now? They still have their bases, but it seems pretty tenuous.
Yes, they have a base in Khmeimim, and they have access to their port. But, Syria has allowed them, the Syrian government has allowed Russia to maintain their position there. But it's done it in a sense because it's not sure if America is really going to go through with this support for Damascus. It's wanted to make sure that Europe and the West continue to support lifting sanctions, consolidation of the country, withdrawal from the Northeast, all of which has been happening. And it's been happening in part because the West does not want Syria to go back to Russia, to Iran. It wants to make sure that it cuts relations with both of those countries, and it ends up firmly in the Western camp.
Well, Joshua Landis, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Always a pleasure talking with you, Ian.
Well, thank you. And I've been speaking with Joshua Landis, who's the Sandra Mackey Chair and Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies and the Farzaneh Family Center for Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies at the University of Oklahoma, the past president of the Syrian Studies Association. He is a fellow at the Quincy Institute and writes Syria Comment, a daily newsletter and blog on Syrian politics. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
One more